It is April 26, 1986. The world's worst nuclear disaster has already happened, but the world is going to find out about it almost 2 entire days later. This is the story of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, not the story that unfolded on the ground, the explosion of reactor 4, what it did to the environment, or even the intricate web of political decisions that influenced everything about the story, but the story of Chernobyl as told by human DNA, and the unique things we know about this code that writes our life because of accidents just like this. At 1:23 a.m. on the 26th of April in 1986, reactor 4 in the Chernobyl nuclear plant explodes. The fire that resulted due to this explosion would last for more than 10 days. But contrary to popular belief, only 2 people died on that night, Valery Kodemchuk and Vladimir Sheshenov. But in the months following the accident, the true effects of radiation exposure on the human body started to become clear. Victims experiencing acute radiation syndrome flooded the ERs of Kiev and Minsk, and doctors at the time did not exactly know what they were dealing with or what was the right treatment.
134 liquidators would be diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome after the accident. 20 of them died in the first 4 months, and 19 more died over the next 20 years. But this is where the biggest myth starts about radiation as well. Al Shapiro is a medical doctor and one of the first responders that tended to hundreds of the victims immediately after the event. She did an incredible interview with Vanity Fair, dispelling a lot of the myths that you saw in the miniseries. But one of her most important points was this.
My boss asked me to collect information about radiation to make a presentation in front of medical personnel at the largest hospital in Kiev, just to give them the basic ideas about radiation and what to expect, how to treat patients. Nobody had any training in radiation, neither at the medical school nor during our careers. I entered the National Medical Library in Kiev and stared in disbelief on the empty shelves with no books. I asked the librarian to provide me some books or journals about radiation, and the answer was they received an order from the above to take all the books and journals from the shelves that contain a word radiation.
Workers in a nuclear plant all the way over here in Sweden noticed that their clothes had a suspiciously high amount of radiation. This set off a number of safety protocols in order to establish the source of the radiation exposure, and soon enough they realized that it was not coming from their own plant, but it was coming from somewhere else. The force of the explosion had sent radioactive particles all the way high up in the atmosphere, where they were able to be carried by strong winds. All the while, more than 46,000 residents of the nearby town of Pripyat were getting exposed to radioactive elements the entire time. And it was only 36 hours later that they would be evacuated and an exclusion zone would be set. This is how we know about 2 of the most important effects in radiation exposure. One is on the children that were evacuated from the area, and 2 was in the liquidators, or the specialized cleaners that entered the most dangerous parts of the broken down reactor in order to clean up the mess and make sure that another explosion, this time even more destructive, would not occur. The children were made a priority. However, many families and institutions did not want to receive them, believing that they were dirty or somehow still radioactive themselves and would be able to expose to radiation the people that it would come in contact with. That is one of the biggest myths about Chernobyl and radiation.
I'm here to see my husband.
You can see him for 30 minutes, not a minute more. And you cannot touch him in any way. Do you understand? Room 15.
The type of radiation that the nuclear disaster resulted to is known as gamma radiation. Every single thing you see, including visible light, is technically radiation, but the types that can cause damage to our cells are very specific types. When gamma rays hit cells, they have the unique ability to break our DNA. That does not cause the person itself to become radioactive. However, the nuclear reactor did emit a particularly radioactive type of iodine, iodine 131. Iodine is usually absorbed by a thyroid.
This was the most pronounced health effect due to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. By 2005, over 6,000 cases of childhood thyroid cancer were reported in the nearby areas. Luckily, the survival rate of thyroid cancer is high, nearly 99%, and the latest studies attribute an extra 15 deaths due to this condition.
You see, part of the reason why we have chromosomes in the first place is in order to tightly pack DNA strands and protect them from exposure to damage. The liquidators of Chernobyl was a group of over 600,000 men and women that went in to clean up the mess. You see, the biggest problem at the time was the real possibility that one of the other reactors would also explode, or this nuclear waste would find its way into the river, in which case it would be incredibly difficult to contain, and everything downstream of it, including the city of Kiev, would suffer devastating effects. The liquidators of Chernobyl were recognized as national heroes. The aftermath of this disaster would undoubtedly have been worse, and they are the group with by far the worst outcomes. Some of them dying in the days after the disaster from acute radiation syndrome, which includes terrible burns, and many more suffering from increased rates of cancers and mild dysplastic syndrome in the years following. However, the most terrifying type of mutation that scientists wanted to establish whether it had occurred was a type of mutation that is far deadlier than all the rest. That is because this type of mutation can not only affect one individual or the exposed group, but could potentially be passed down from generation to generation. These mutations are known as DNMs, or de novo mutations, and they occur when radiation affects sperm or eggs, therefore making mutations that will be passed down to children and potentially affecting entire family lineages. It was only 4 years ago that 2 incredible studies following both parents and children from the exclusion zone were able to establish that such DNMs have not occurred because of the Chernobyl disaster.
The Chernobyl nuclear disaster has been enveloped in a cloud of myth and fiction since its very first moments. Over the years, there have been countless studies published on the fatality rates and the effects on the health of the population exposed to atomic radiation after the accident. However, many had to be retracted due to fraudulent claims and gaps in their scientific process. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation has undertaken one of the most extensive investigations into the Chernobyl nuclear accident. It has concluded that there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to radiation exposure 20 years after the accident, and has highlighted the role of media on misleading stories and misinformation following the story.
Unlike people who were for the most part evacuated, and only a small number of them have legally resettled back into the exclusion zone since the disaster, plants and animals did not get that choice. So if you want to know what happened to them, let me know in the comments below and I will make a video on it.